Welcome back to Ready Player None, the only podcast where the games are mashed up and the points don't matter. Previously, Wade had reunited with his horrible friends, but they discovered they were being observed. There's a lot to talk about in this one, so let's dive into Chapter 33. The interloper in Aech's basement, a private chat room, is Ogden Morrow himself. He admits to having been watching them for some time. When asked how he got into a private chat room, he tells them that he and Halliday's avatars have God mode powers. Prior to the original launch of the Oasis, when Jim and I created our avatars, we gave ourselves super user access to the entire simulation. In addition to being immortal and invincible, our avatars could go pretty much anywhere and do pretty much anything. Now that Anorak is gone, my avatar is the only one with these powers. He assures them that the Sixers couldn't eavesdrop on them in the same way. Wade figures out that he was the one who knocked over that stack of comic books, way back in Chapter 15. Og nodded and gave us a guilty shrug. That was me. I can be pretty clumsy at times. I thought that was Artemis who did that. My Artemis Sixer spy theory is losing credibility by the second. It's a strange thing here that I don't think I have time to get caught up on. The narrative refers to him as Og. Og nodded. You just heard me say it. After an awestruck silence, Wade addresses him as Mr. Morrow. Please, Morrow said, raising a hand, call me Og. So the narrative has already started calling him Og before he insists on being called Og in the same sentence as he's addressed as Morrow. I don't know what's going on there. Wade asks Og why he's been eavesdropping on them, and Og tells them he wants to help. He's not going to provide them any clues in the hunt, that'd ruin the fun. But despite rumours he never spoke to Halliday in the last 10 years of his life, Halliday had let him back into the fold a few weeks before he passed. He just called me up out of the blue and we met in a private chat room session, much like this one. Then he told me about his illness, the contest, and what he had planned. He was worried there might still be a few bugs in the gates, or that complications might arise after he was gone that would prevent the contest from proceeding as he'd intended. Remember when I made a gag about Halliday not having any QC testers? Well, it looks like he had one. Og never wanted the responsibility, but he agreed to the dying wish of his oldest friend. After hearing you describe your current circumstances, I think the time has finally come for me to take action, to maintain the integrity of Jim's game. Og offers them sanctuary in his home in Oregon. I can provide each of you with a state-of-the-art immersion rig, a fibre-optic connection to the Oasis, and anything else you might need. Wade blurts out a thank you. Og has also already chartered flights for both Shoto and Artemis to get to Oregon. You'd think this would also be a gross violation of privacy, but the narrative never seems to call it up. In fact, in gratitude, Artemis throws her arms around Og in a bear hug. As for the other two, Og tells Aech to use his RV to pick Wade up, and then they can take a jet from the Columbus airport. That is, if you boys don't mind sharing a ride. No, that sounds perfect, Aech said, glancing at me sideways. Og smiles grimly despite the sheer wave of gratitude from the Gunters. This is going to be interesting, I said, stealing a quick glance at Artemis. The four of us are finally going to meet in person. It will be an honour, Shoto said. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, Artemis said, locking eyes with me. I can't wait. Girl, don't. Page break! Wade gives Aech his location in this plug internet cafe thing. Aech warns him. I don't look anything like my avatar. So, who does? I'm not really this tall, or muscular, and my nose is slightly bigger. I'm just warning you. Meeting me might be kind of a shock for you. Okay, then why don't you just tell me what you look like right now? This kind of perception of who you are on the Oasis has been brought up a couple of times, but never really developed much. Wade seems paranoid that anyone he speaks to is going to be some hairy-knuckled middle-aged guy who likes chatting up young teen boys. And then there's Artemis's whole deal about how she doesn't want Wade to know her real appearance because she's self-conscious about the port wine stain on her face. But in all, the idea that you can be anything in the Oasis, the huge transhumanism theme of cyberpunk works, is almost completely absent. Let that stand as a context for what happens next. Aech ignores this question and tells him he's on the way. Despite what I'd said to Aech, knowing that I was about to meet him in person after all these years made me more nervous than I wanted to admit. That's fine, that's a human reaction. But it was nothing compared to the apprehension I already felt building inside me at the prospect of meeting Artemis once we reached Oregon. I have had enough of you. Did I still have any kind of chance with her at all? I've got two answers to that. Judging from the behaviour you've exhibited? No. Judging from the fact that this is a white male's wish fulfillment fantasy? Yes. Wade sends out the email to every Oasis user. He posts it to every Gunter message board, and he records his avatar saying it, putting it on a loop on his Twitch stream or whatever it was. Within an hour, the Gunters are whipped up in this call to arms. We're given 3 headlines as examples, but I didn't initially clock that it wasn't just one really long, confusing headline. Gunters declare all-out war on the Sixers, and top Gunters accuse IOI of kidnapping and murder, and is the hunt for Halliday's Easter egg finally over? 3 headlines, guys. Not one. His accusations of Daito's murder are also in the news. By now, Sorrento must have figured out that someone's been inside their database. He also takes the time to kit out his avatar for battle and take a quick nap before Aech gets there, saying he drifted off in the haptic chair with my new jacket draped over me as a blanket, clutching in one hand the pistol I'd purchased earlier that day. I still think it's completely wild that Wade just owns a gun. Page break! So, here we f***ing go. Aech's ringtone wakes Wade up. The RV's waiting outside. Wade returns his rental gear and goes outside to find it's nighttime. He must have been sleeping for a while. Aech's RV's there on the corner and it looks like a battered old thing. 20 years old, rusty, covered in solar panels and with tinted black windows. Wade trepidatiously crosses over to the RV and a door automatically opens and closes behind him. It's dark and cramped, there's a kitchen, there's a bedroom, and he heads up to the cab. A heavy-set African-American girl sat in the RV's driver's seat, clutching the wheel tightly and staring straight ahead. She was about my age, with short, kinky hair and chocolate-coloured skin that appeared iridescent in the soft glow of the dashboard indicators. Don't say chocolate-coloured skin. I've seen it written that saying someone's skin is chocolate-coloured is fetishization at best and dominating through dehumanization at worst. Not a good look so far. She was wearing a vintage Rush 2112 concert t-shirt and the numbers were warped around her large bosom. Alright. Necessary. She also had on faded black jeans and a pair of studded combat boots. She appeared to be shivering even though it was nice and warm in the cab. She turns around and gives him a Cheshire Cat grin. And Wade knows Aech's characteristic smile anywhere. I also recognised the set of her eyes and the lines of her face. There was no doubt in my mind. The young woman sitting in front of me was my best friend, Aech. There she is. A wave of emotion washed over me. Shock gave way to a sense of betrayal. How could she, deceive me all these years? Not a good look. A person I trusted implicitly. Someone I thought I knew. She avoids his eye contact and Wade plonks down in the passenger seat. He notices how nervous she is. Whatever anger or betrayal I felt quickly evaporated. He starts to laugh. The tension goes out of her shoulders and she half laughs and half cries as well. It's an okay moment of relief and understanding. When she speaks, Wade realises she'd been disguising her voice in the Oasis with a filter, but she still sounds like Aech. Well, I said, look at us. Here we are. Yeah, Aech replied, here we are.
Look at us. Hey, look at us.
Look at us. Huh? Who would have thought?
There's an uncomfortable silence and then they have a big hug. I knew you were hiding something, but I never imagined... What? She said, a bit defensively. You never imagined what? That the famous Aech, renowned gunter and the most feared and ruthless arena combatant in the entire Oasis was, in reality, a fat black chick? I was going to say young African-American woman. And then the immediate sentence after is, her expression darkened. Could you not have picked just a slightly different turn of phrase there? She says she had a reason for not telling him, but he says it doesn't matter. Of course not. You're my best friend, Aech. My only friend, to be honest. She wants to explain, but he tells her he'd rather do it in the air and they've got to get the RV rolling. Page break. How magnanimous. I'll still be your best friend even though you're a black woman. No. This is the one spoiler I knew about going into this. And I've obliquely hinted at it a few times before now. Wade had once asked him if he looked anything like his avatar in real life. Yes, but in real life I'm even more handsome. Don't look up the movie posters for Ready Player One, by the way. His real name begins with an H. We'll get back to that. Aech, on the other hand, was smart enough to give a fake name and address when he enrolled. I know what's coming. Spoilers. Put a pin in that. That's the catchphrase for this podcast. We will unpack that later. You're the man, Aech. Yes, he said, smiling. It's true. I am. I think it's one of the biggest clangers Ernest Cline ever dropped, and I've read some of his slam poetry. But we'll get back to that in a moment. So after the page break, they've driven, I assume in silence, to a private hangar near Columbus Airport. Og has arranged not only a private jet for them, but also storage for Aech's RV, which she's nervous to leave because it's been her home for many years. Put a pin in that. Wade says that these days only rich people can afford to fly in aeroplanes. He and Aech had never got on one before or even seen one in person. Like the taxi cabs, it's also completely automated, allowing them to get to Oregon discreetly. They silently take in the views for a long time, but when the novelty wears off, Wade can tell Aech is ready to talk about her past. So Aech launches into this life story. We've known forever that her name begins with an H, but it's not Humperdinck, it's Helen Harris. She's a few months older than Wade and was raised by a single mother after her father died in Afghanistan. I don't know if Ernest Cline was still expecting US troops to be in Afghanistan 30 years after this book was written, but I don't know. Her mother, Marie, worked from home in an online data processing centre. In Marie's opinion, the Oasis was the best thing that had ever happened to both women and people of colour. From the very start, Marie had used a white male avatar to conduct all of her online business because of the marked difference it made in how she was treated and the opportunities she was given. Yeah. Sad, but true. So Aech had followed in her mum's footsteps, designing a white male avatar of her own and naming it after her childhood nickname, Aech. Even her official school documentation has it that she's a white male student, attached with an image of a photo-real rendition of her avatar, which she'd modelled after her own features. Okay, I don't think I'm anywhere near qualified to unpack how this white male face is directly based on the structure of a black woman's, so all I'm going to say is yikes. Aech goes for the hat trick of marginalised groups in sci-fi stories. Not only is she a black woman, she's also a lesbian. She came out to her mum on her 18th birthday and hasn't spoken to her since. By that point, she'd been dating a girl online for nearly a year, being booted out of your home for your sexuality. Again, sad but true. So that's 3 big chunky paragraphs about Aech's life story so far, and the first we're told of Wade's reaction is that he's relieved to find out that she's a lesbian after all the times they'd discussed our mutual admiration for the female form. Don't make this about you. Aech tells him how she's gone through a series of shelters, eventually earning enough money in the Oasis arenas to buy an RV, and I've been living in it ever since. Right? That pin I mentioned not long ago? Here it is, this is the pin. The RV has apparently been her home for many years, but she's also not much older than Wade. So there's been a many-year period between age 18 and age 19. I don't think you quite thought that one through. But then, not thinking things through is a recurring theme. As we continued to talk, going through the motions of getting to know each other, I realised that we already did know each other, as well as any two people could. See? That's quite sweet. This is the closest relationship you have with a person, and you've reconciled your friendship after drifting apart. None of that had changed, or could be changed by anything as inconsequential as her gender, or skin colour, or sexual orientation. Now you're pushing it a bit. You're saying you can still be friends with her despite her being a fat black lesbian. If you don't see colour or listen to marginalised voices, you can't boost them when they're in need. General life lesson. So yeah, they fall back into this familiar rhythm and have a chat like they always do, just in person instead of in the Oasis. They were flying west, so it's still dark by the time they reach Oregon, at Ogg's private runway. Even in the dim moonlight, the view is breathtaking. The dark, towering silhouettes of the Wallowa Mountains surrounded us on all sides. So there's a cobblestone staircase and there's a mansion on top of a plateau. There's waterfalls, natural beauty everywhere. And then Aech says, it looks just like Rivendell. I nodded. It looks exactly like Rivendell in the Lord of the Rings movies, I said, still staring up at it in awe. Yep, she just said that. Thanks for explaining what she said back to her. You've only known she's a woman for about a few hours and you're mansplaining. Ogg's wife was a big Tolkien fan, remember? He built this place for her. The jet flies off again and they head up the staircase, where Ogg is there to greet them, in a plaid bathrobe and bunny slippers. So he welcomes them to his home. Ah, you must be Aech, he replied, clasping her hand. If he was surprised by her appearance, he didn't show it. I recognise your voice. He gave her a wink, followed by a bear hug. And he greets Wade as both Wade and Parzival, saying it's an honour to meet them both. He leads him towards his enormous house, saying it's great to have visitors because he's been alone since Kira died. He was silent a moment, then he laughed. Alone except for my cooks, maids and gardeners, of course, but they all live here too, so they don't really count as visitors. You know, if Ernie was going for an anti-corporation message, he's then immediately allied his characters with the richest person on the planet. Wade asks if Artemis or Shoto have arrived yet. Something about the way I said Artemis made Morrow chuckle, long and loud. After a few seconds, I realised Aech was laughing at me too. Ogden tells them that Artemis felt it would be a distraction if they met before the big battle, and Shoto agreed. He tells them they're already logged in, preparing for your assault on the Sixers. His voice echoed across the grounds and off the high stone walls of his mansion. Follow me, the hour draws near. And then this turns into a long walk through the world's largest mansion. The place is somehow both floodlit and moonlit. There's a courtyard with a small gated-in flower garden, featuring Kira Morrow's tombstone. But even in the bright moonlight, it was still too dark for me to make out the inscription on the headstone. There's a lavish entrance. Instead of lights, he uses an actual torch. And the place is filled with tapestries, fantasy artwork, gargoyles and suits of armour. Wade gushes tomorrow about how he loved his childhood Halcydonia interactive games. Those edutainment games Ogden and Kira coded together. Aech snickers, but Og seems genuinely pleased. There's a room featuring row after row of old video games, which they presume is Halliday's collection, bequeathed to Morrow in his will. I thought he'd bequeathed them a bunch of arcade cabinets. Maybe I'm misremembering. Og then takes them down a spiral stone staircase to an elevator. Why the staircase? Not elevator? Oh. And then the lift takes them down several more floors to the basement. How big is this place? How much money does this guy have? We followed Og through a maze of carpeted hallways until we reached a row of 7 circular doorways, each numbered. These are Morrow's personal immersion bays, with all the mod cons. Artemis and Shoto are already there logged in. I stared at the doors, wondering which one Artemis was behind. Every opportunity you have to be a creep, you just dive straight in. He provides them with haptic suits and gloves, and tells them the clock is ticking. H goes to say something to Wade, but words seem to fail her. After a few seconds, she stuck out her gloved hand. I took it. Good luck, H, I said. Good luck, Z, she replied. Then she gives Og a grateful kiss on the cheek and disappears into one of the immersion bays. Og grinned after her, then turned to face me. The whole world is rooting for the 4 of you. Try not to let them down. Wade says he'll do their best, but before he gets into his own bay, he says, Og, can I ask you one question? I wanted to ask what it was that ended your friendship with Halliday. In all the research I've done, I've never been able to find out. What happened? Morrow studies him for a moment. He's always been reticent on the subject, but presumably Wade's brown-nosing from earlier, my interpretation, not the text, has loosened his lips a bit. Now I know my Artemis 6 spy theory fell down, but here's confirmation that Kira drove a wedge between them. Not quite in the way that I thought, because I was expecting them to have fought over her, but she's still considered a prize to be won by Halliday. Like me, he'd been in love with her since high school. Of course, he never had the courage to act on it, so she never knew how he felt about her, and neither did I. Og says that Halliday was never any good with expressing himself. He only told him right before he died. Even after Kira and I got engaged, I think Jim still harboured some fantasy of stealing her away from me. But once we got married, he abandoned that notion. Halliday found that his jealousy was too much to continue their friendship, and that's why he broke it off. It was impossible not to fall in love with her. He smiled at me. You know what it's like to meet someone like that, don't you? I do, I said. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you that the entire romance from earlier in the book was told and not shown. We have no idea what they communicated like. We've never seen Wade and Artemis in a relationship. Just saying. Wade thanks Og for telling him that, and then he disappears into his own immersion rig. Inside, I could see that his rig had been modified to include several strange components, including an Oasis console modified to look like a vintage Commodore 64. Obsolete technology so much cooler. Og tells him he's not going to help them in the fight. He's going to sit back and watch. This looks to be the most epic battle in video game history. That's just embarrassing. After a few minutes' thought, Wade heads into his own immersion bay. The room's a big sphere like Cerebro in the X-Men films. There was no omnidirectional treadmill because the room itself served that function. It was like being inside a giant hamster ball. Sometimes, Ernie, your simple analogies make things sound a lot less cooler than what you think they are. He climbs into a haptic chair on a hydraulic arm. A visor slips on his face and adjusts itself to fit perfectly, like Marty McFly's automatic shoes. And then he speaks in his new passphrase, Reindeer Flotilla C-Tech Astronomy. Anyone in the comments want to explain what that means? Because I have no idea. I took a deep breath as the system logged me in. End chapter 33. Right. So, with very little, almost imperceptible foreshadowing, Ernest Cline has dropped in that Aech is a black lesbian. As I said earlier, this was the one spoiler I knew about before going in, and because I've already read up on it, I know that it affects nothing. The inclusion of a racial and sexual minority shouldn't be some gotcha moment. It shouldn't be a ta-da, a self-congratulatory pat on the back that you managed to include a character like that. Because for the previous 300-odd pages, Aech has been presented as no different than a white man. I understand that in-universe that is presented as the entire idea. She's masking her identity to be taken more seriously by her peers. But this book takes place 40 years into the future, and you couldn't just envision for a minute a world without racism? So instead you write a character with internalized prejudice about herself. We couldn't have this underdog story about how she overcame adversity to become the Oasis's top gladiator. It is purely a token gesture. Like I said, she's 3 things that in a sci-fi story are considered minorities. Black, female, and gay. In fact, this makes her one of two major living female characters. Kira's a plot device. Mrs. Gilmore's dead. Wade's teacher, his auntie, his mom, insignificant. It comes off as him dumping all this representation in the back end of the book. We're in chapter 33 out of
39.
And it barely comes up again. I'm told here that Wade even goes on to insist on using male pronouns for her, even though having her avatar as a masquerade is the only extent to which Aech says anything about her gender. Aech never says anything about her gender being anything other than a cis woman. I mean, I know this part hasn't happened yet, but what is that about? So this is 50% of this book's representation of women, but it's 100% of its representation of LGBTQ characters and black characters. There are literally no other queer or black characters in this book so far. It's incredibly tokenistic. It never comes up. I understand that nothing more of this is really made of it. It's a bad idea all round. And I know I'm not alone on that, because the movie adaptation handles the race issue completely differently. Aech's avatar in the movie is an orc, and I can't decide if that's an even bigger yikes or not. Representation-wise, they clearly made the effort to have her portrayed by a black actress. They've not cast a white man to take the role of a queer person of colour, but having your only black character be an orc? Is that even worse? So what's the alternative then? If you had Aech present as a black woman the whole way through, you could still have integrated this story about how she initially presented as a white man, but came to terms with being herself, overcoming her own internalized prejudices. But she doesn't, that's not there. And given that he writes the two Japanese characters as both samurai and otaku, a rolled up collection of every Japanese stereotype he can think of, I hate to see what he would have trotted out for a black character. I nearly let the cat out of the bag in episode 22. You know, when Ernest Cline made up that word about Pac-Man's suicide. Up until that point, the book had avoided mentioning Pac-Man so as to not call attention to the fact that it was plot relevant. And in the same chapter, I criticised the book's complete dearth of references to media by people of colour. Those two observations stem from the same problem. The lack of black culture was intended to mask the surprise plot twist of Aech's ethnicity. But that still means you've written a book about pop culture from the 80s that doesn't mention Eddie Murphy in Coming to America, or Beverly Hills Cop, or Whoopi Goldberg and Danny Glover in The Color Purple. You know, no Prince, no Michael Jackson, no Stevie Wonder, no Whitney Houston, no Lionel Richie or Janet Jackson or Different Strokes. What are you talking about, Willis? I've had some of these ideas buzzing around my head because I knew this chapter was coming, and I nearly said that the only black-led TV show, movie, book, or album that he's ever mentioned was Family Matters. And I looked it up, and no, he didn't even mention that. He mentioned Family Ties, the sitcom about upper-middle-class white people. If you want some sort of diversity points for including this character, you've still written 314 consecutive pages with 0 black people. Well done. You certainly thought that through. I'm glad your book dedicated more real estate to circle jerking about 8-bit video games and not taking to task the real problems of racism and gatekeeping in modern fandom. Oh, and by the way, speaking of the movie adaptation, they skip over the fact that she's gay. So there's problems in modern cinema as well for you. I'm sure your erasure of POC voices is doing tons to help. If you want more misguided attempts to put the world to rights, you can follow me on Twitter at @TheLastGherkin or follow the show on Twitter at @RPN_pod. Watch along with subtitles on YouTube The Last Gherkin and stay tuned for some sort of MP3 download thing. Next time, let battle be joined as the Gunters face the Sixers and I try to face reading the rest of this book. Ba-ba-ba-ba. Bum. Og offers them... I hate saying the word og, and I've obliquely hinted at it a few times before now. This is where I'd put clips. I touched upon it briefly at the end of one of the chapters about Daito and Shoto. I don't remember. I'm going to have to look that up. I used the word dearth, so I'll know which one it's in. I'm glad your book dedicated much more real estate to jacking off